It seems extraordinary that a whole week and more has been wasted in Canberra on point scoring over the Hong Kong-born federal member for Chisholm, Gladys Liu. Our colleague Andrew Bolt was outstanding last week in challenging the rookie Victorian Liberal, obviously unskilled in the forensic world of television interviews, and she refused to denounce China's activities in the South China Sea. She declined to name Communist Party leader Xi Jinping as a dictator. She avoided questions about her alleged links to a Communist Party-backed organisation, and this has led to a rather heated but very much overdue and frank debate about Australia and China. That prompted Kerry Stokes, a very decent human being, at the end of last week to urge Scott Morrison to visit Beijing and reset the relationship. Even yesterday we learnt that Chinese spies had hacked the federal parliament's computer network in the lead up to this year's federal election. And the Australian Signals Directorate has said China's Ministry of State Security was responsible for the sophisticated attack, and we're told the hack was one of the more than 1,500 cyber incidents recorded in the past year, and a level of sophistication that only 4 nations could achieve: China, Russia, the US and Israel. And the report said there was evidence the hackers had been seeking access to emails and databases, Beijing flexing its muscles. The brouhaha over Gladys Liu, the Hong Kong pro-democracy protests, problems with trade and the perception, perhaps also the reality, of an expansionist foreign policy by China, all these things are very critical to Australia's future. The Gladys Liu episode is very much the thin edge of the wedge. The reality is, a Lowy Institute poll last month found that only 32% of Australians trust China to act responsibly in the world. 70% said we should try to prevent Beijing's growing influence in the Pacific. 75% said we're too economically dependent on China because it's the main destination for our resource exports. 1/3 of the $35 billion in our education export income is from China. But the concern is surely too little too late. Figures from the tax office indicate that as at June 30 last year, 50 million hectares, more than 13.6% of Australia's agricultural land, the best land, is owned or partly controlled by foreigners. And now, with rural Australia on its knees, watch the international vultures descend again. China owns 29% of Australian foreign-owned farmland. No one seems to care. A lot of this happened when Scott Morrison was Treasurer. The Chinese developer Country Garden has purchased 353 hectares on the outskirts of Melbourne. Country Garden is China's 3rd largest developer, controlled by the richest woman in Asia. This is land right on top of Melbourne, 353 hectares. China's Fucheng Group acquired the almost 5,000-hectare Woodhouse station from the famous Baillieu family. It's only 37 kilometres from Melbourne, $100 million. The Chinese company Shanghai Zhongfu bought the 476,000-hectare cattle station Carlton Hill and the nearby 2,000-hectare Ivanhoe station, both former Durack properties near Kununurra in the Kimberley in Western Australia, for about $100 million. This was all approved by Treasurer Scott Morrison. China's Dashang Group purchased a 3,500-hectare Wootton Farm cattle property, glorious country near Scone, along with the property's 1,100 head of prestigious Wagyu cattle herd, one of Australia's oldest, back in 2016, $12 to $20 million, magnificent country. Reefer Capital Holding Group Australia, a fully owned subsidiary of the Chinese textile company Zhejiang Reefer, bought the prized 22,000-hectare Kupla Kuripa cattle property, glorious country, between Gloucester and Nowendock in New South Wales, $29 million. And they purchased 2 adjoining riverfront properties for a piddling $3 million. Van Diemen's Land Company, Australia's oldest and largest dairy farming outfit, 25 dairy farms, 19,000 hectares, 29,000 dairy cattle, has been sold to a Chinese buyer for $280 million. And now we learn of a Chinese takeover bid, $1.5 billion, do you mind, for the Tasmanian infant milk formula producer Bellamy's by a company whose 2nd biggest shareholder is a Chinese government-owned outfit called COFCO. Our paddock, but the food goes onto Chinese plates. Have we woken up? Or will we tick this off as well? Where does it end? The Chinese company Shandong Delisi Foods bought a 45% stake in the New South Wales meat processing company Bindari Beef for $70 million. In one 2-month period back in 2015, Chinese investors spent $120 million buying Australian farms. You see, Canberra don't know the difference between ownership and investment. And that's why Mr Morrison's quiet Australians are now concerned. It's only as a result of massive public pressure that this Hong Kong-based CKI outfit were prevented from buying the Australian company APA Group for $13 billion. Now, APA owned 13 of Australia's 30 major gas pipelines, stretching across 15,000 kilometres, comprising virtually the entire East Coast gas pipeline grid and transporting more than half of Australia's domestic gas. They own the Dampier to Bunbury gas pipeline in WA, Australia's biggest pipeline. They own half of Victoria's electricity network and virtually all of South Australia's electricity network. And until some of us kicked up a hell of a stink, this was going to be sold. This critical infrastructure, 70% of our electricity and gas infrastructure, sold to an outfit controlled by China. They already own 103,000 hectares of land in Australia. Is there any mainland China critical infrastructure asset relating to gas or electricity transmission that's owned or controlled by foreign investment in China? I could be here all night articulating ownership of blue ribbon assets by interests associated with the Chinese government. The Chinese theme park company, Songcheng Performance Development, paid over $1 billion for Norwell Valley sugarcane farms, covering over 6,000 hectares between Brisbane and the Gold Coast. And they're going to develop the site, we're told, into a city over 25 years. Who for? And why? Is the concern by Australians legitimate? Well, may we argue, as Kerry Stokes has, that the Prime Minister visit Beijing and reset the relationship? And well may Canberra sort out a few definitions. Investment is not the same as ownership. We have to be able to trade with China, our largest trading partner. Kerry Stokes is right. Our whole standard of living is determined by the exports we make to China. So all this debate about Gladys Liu doesn't help. But we do have a story to tell. We love investment because our capital base is not big enough. But that's different from ownership. And when Chinese interests own our water, our coal, our dairy farms, our beef farms, our avocado farms, our Tasmanian cherry orchards, we're entitled to ask, where does this end and what's the agenda? We're also entitled to ask whether this very significant expansion towards ownership of some of Australia's best assets, we're entitled to ask, is this a long-term threat to national security? It would be a brave person who argued it wasn't. Does it go on unchecked? So instead of agitating over Gladys Liu, we ought to face the certain reality that China has established a very significant foothold in this country, cherry-picking some of our finest assets. No one in government, on either side, blinked an eyelid. Now we're worried about a newly elected member of Parliament. And don't forget, in 2015, we had this absurd decision to lease the port of Darwin for 99 years to a Chinese energy and infrastructure group heavily involved with and identified with the Chinese Communist government. We should remember the words of John Garneau, an Australian and Mandarin-speaking former Beijing correspondent with the Sydney Morning Herald. He had been retained by the federal government to write a classified report on China's operations in Australia. Wrote Garneau in part, I quote, "China is still trapped in the cycle which has created and destroyed every dynasty that's gone before. In this tradition, when you lose political power, you don't just lose your job while keeping your super, as you might in our rather gentrified arrangement. You lose your wealth, you lose your freedom, you probably lose your life, and possibly your entire extended family. You're literally erased from history. Winners take all, and losers lose everything." He went on, "The key point about Communist Party ideology, the unbroken thread that runs from Lenin through Stalin, Mao and Xi, is that the party is and always has defined itself as being in perpetual struggle with the hostile forces of Western liberalism," unquote. I think a few people in Canberra, from the Prime Minister down, need to do a bit of homework.